A 27-year-old black woman walked into a Georgia courthouse alone. The judge owned stock in the company suing her father. He did not know she had already found it. Nobody in that room understood what was about to happen. If you drove through Morrow, Georgia, on a Sunday afternoon in late October, you might think it was the kind of town that had figured something out. The oak trees along Main Street had turned gold and amber, dropping leaves onto sidewalks that somebody still bothered to sweep. The brick storefronts carried hand-painted signs that had been there for decades, and the American flags hanging from the porches of the North Side homes snapped clean in the autumn wind. You might pull over, roll down your window, breathe in the smell of wood smoke and cut grass, and think, this is what America is supposed to look like. You would be half right. The half you could see from a car window was fine. The half you had to live in was something else entirely. Morrow had a population of 12,000 people and two very different experiences of being alive inside that number. On the north side, potholes got filled within a week of appearing. Code inspectors came by to ensure buildings met standard, and when they found violations, those violations were handled quickly and without drama. New condominiums had been going up on Birchfield Avenue for 3 years running, each one advertised on glossy banners as a sign of progress, of investment, of the town's bright future. On the south side, potholes became landmarks that people used to give directions. Code inspectors appeared every 6 weeks, but not to help, to cite, to fine, to document violations that somehow never got resolved no matter how much money the residents spent trying to fix them. The buildings on the south side were getting older in a way that felt deliberate, as if someone had decided that deterioration was a feature rather than a problem. And for the past 5 years, a name had been appearing on property transfer documents across the south side with increasing frequency. Crestline Property Group, a barbershop on Oleander that had been in the same family for 30 years, gone. A beauty supply store that anchored the corner of 5th and Marsh, gone. A community laundromat that 300 families depended on, gone. Each one purchased, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through pressure that stopped just short of what you could legally call coercion, and folded into Crestline's expanding portfolio. The people of the South Side called it what it was when they were among themselves, in their kitchens and on their porches after the children had gone to bed. They called it erasure. They called it the same thing that had happened before, with different paperwork. But when the disputes arose, and they always arose, every single case landed on the desk of one man, Judge Warren Hargrove, 58 years old, third-generation Morrow. 18 years on the bench, preceded by his father, preceded by his grandfather. A line of authority so unbroken, it had calcified into something nobody questioned anymore. In Morrow, the Hargrove name didn't just carry weight. It was the architecture everything else was built around. No attorney in the county had successfully challenged one of his rulings. No appeal had ever come back reversed. And if you were black and standing in his courtroom, the outcome had been decided before the bailiff called the room to order. Everyone in Morrow understood this. The understanding lived in the pauses, before people answered certain questions, in the way eyes dropped when certain names were mentioned, in the careful, practiced silence of people who had learned that speaking the truth out loud in the wrong room had consequences that arrived later, quietly, through channels you couldn't trace back to anyone in particular. What nobody in Morrow understood, what nobody anywhere had yet thought to look for, was that the silence protecting Warren Hargrove was about to be broken by someone he would never have considered a threat. The sign had been fading for years, but Raymond Carter had never gotten around to repainting it, not because he didn't care, but because every time he budgeted for paint and 2 free hours on a Saturday, something else came up. A transmission that couldn't wait, a single mother whose alternator had died on the highway, a neighbor who needed a coolant flush and couldn't afford the shop rate downtown. Raymond was that kind of man, the kind who fixed things for people who couldn't afford to be fixed. Carter's Auto and Body Shop sat on the south end of Oleander Street, in a building Raymond and his wife Diane had purchased 20 years ago with money they had saved for 6 years, dollar by dollar, working 2 jobs each, while raising their daughter Maya in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner 3 blocks east. The day they signed the deed, Diane had cried, not dramatically but steadily, the way water moves through a crack in stone, and Raymond had framed the deed and hung it on the wall behind the cash register where it had stayed ever since. The floors were swept every single night before Raymond locked up, a habit so ingrained that his hands would find the broom automatically, even on evenings when exhaustion had made the rest of his body slow. Beside the cash register, next to the framed deed, hung a photograph of Diane. She had died 5 years ago, 14 months after the diagnosis, after every savings account had been emptied and every emergency fund exhausted, trying to fight something that ultimately could not be fought. It was the result of loving someone enough to try everything, and Raymond had never once regretted a single dollar of it. He did regret, quietly and without telling anyone, the toll those years had taken on Maya, who had been 20 when her mother got sick and had been carrying something heavier than her age ever since. In the bottom drawer of the desk in the back office, beneath a stack of old invoices, Raymond kept a document he had never shown his daughter. It was a photocopied court ruling from 1987, thin as a pressed flower, the ink beginning to ghost at the edges. In that ruling, his own father, Maya's grandfather, had lost a property dispute at the Morrow County Courthouse in a hearing that lasted 35 minutes. The presiding judge had been Arthur Hargrove Sr. Raymond had found the document in a box of his father's belongings and had understood immediately what it meant. The way you understand certain things not through reasoning, but through the body, through a cold settling in the chest that has nothing to do with temperature. He had put it in the drawer and told himself it was history. He had been wrong about that, but he wouldn't know it yet for another month. Not until the Tuesday morning when a man in a gray suit walked through the door of Carter's Auto and Body Shop and set a thick envelope on the counter. Without a word of explanation, there was a photograph on Maya Carter's nightstand, taken 6 years ago at Athens, Georgia, on the steps outside the School of Law. In it, Maya was 21, her textbooks tucked under one arm and her mother's hand in her other, and both of them were laughing at something the photographer had said. Just before the shutter clicked, Diane had driven 3 hours to bring Maya a home-cooked meal on the first day of classes, because she believed that certain beginnings deserved to be marked properly, and Maya had met her in the parking lot and held her for a long time before they walked inside. That had been the beginning. The end had come 14 months later with a phone call at 6 in the morning, and Maya had driven those same 3 hours in reverse, and she had not gone back to Athens after that. She had told herself she would return after things settled. Things did not settle. She worked as a freelance legal assistant for 3 small firms in Morrow and the surrounding counties, handling research and document preparation and procedural filings, earning enough to cover rent and groceries and her share of the household expenses, not enough to pay tuition at Athens or anywhere else. She was 27 years old, and she had been a year and a half into her law degree when her life had rearranged itself around a hospital bed, and most days she managed to carry that fact without letting it bend her posture. The brown leather notebook she carried everywhere was almost full. She had started it the year her mother died and had filled it with observations that most people would not have thought to record. Names on documents, case numbers she had processed for the firm she worked for, dates on transfer deeds, the names of companies appearing on multiple filings, the names of judges assigned to certain kinds of cases. She had not been building anything intentionally, not at first. She had simply been unable to turn off the part of her brain that noticed patterns the way other people noticed weather. But 3 months before the envelope arrived at her father's shop, Maya had begun to see something in her notes that made the back of her neck go cold. 5 different clients, 5 different properties on the south side of Morrow, 5 different cases that had gone to court in the past 4 years. Same acquiring company on every transfer deed, same surveyor named on every boundary assessment, same judge who had ruled on every dispute, same outcome every time. She had circled Crestline Property Group in red ink and drawn lines outward from it like a star, connecting it to Douglas Mercer's name, connecting it to Warren Hargrove's name, connecting it to 5 families who had lost something they could not get back. She had not yet told anyone what she was looking at. She had not yet known that it was also looking at her. It was a Wednesday, early enough that the sun was still working on the mist above Oleander Street when the man in the gray suit came in. He was the kind of man designed to be forgettable. Medium height, middle age, a face arranged into a professional blankness that gave nothing away. He did not ask for Raymond by name. He set the envelope on the counter, said the words, "You've been served," in a tone that suggested he said them many times a day, and left before Raymond had finished wiping his hands on the shop rag. Raymond opened the envelope standing at the counter with grease still under his fingernails, and Maya watched him read, watched the particular stillness that moved through his body, the way a current moves through water, invisible on the surface, but changing the temperature of everything. Crestline Property Group was suing to claim a strip of the Carter property. The legal basis was a boundary discrepancy, a 12-foot error in the original deed. They alleged that placed the entire western wall of the garage on land that Crestline had recently acquired from the Ellison family next door. The demand was clear: vacate within 45 days or face forced removal. Maya took the papers from her father's hands without asking. She read them once quickly and then again slowly, the way she had learned to read documents that were trying to hide something, not in what they said, but in the between, what they claimed and what they could actually prove. When she finished, she set them on the counter and said 2 words, quietly, with the certainty of someone who had spent 3 months mapping exactly what this company did and how. They're lying. Over the following 2 weeks, Raymond visited every attorney he could find. The first one had a golf trophy on his desk and a polished way of explaining why the case was unwinnable. $15,000 just to review the file. And even then, he said, going up against Crestline in Hargrove's courtroom was not a legal proceeding. It was theater with a predetermined script. The second attorney was a woman who had recently moved her practice to Morrow and who turned pale when she heard the judge's name in a way that told Maya everything before she spoke a word. The third was Marcus Webb, who had a small office on the east side of town and kind eyes and the tiredness of a man who had been fighting longer than his body had anticipated. He told Raymond that he had taken a Crestline case 4 years ago, that Hargrove had dismissed it in under an hour, and that in the months that followed, his office lease had doubled, his business license had been flagged for an obscure zoning review, and his largest client had quietly transferred to a firm on the north side without explanation. Maya sat in the back seat during every one of these visits and said nothing, but her notebook was open on her lap, and her pen never stopped, because she understood now that what she was watching was not 3 attorneys declining a case. It was a system demonstrating, with perfect and practiced efficiency, how it protected itself from the people it was built to harm. Raymond signed the paperwork that made it official. He would represent himself, and Maya would stand beside him as his advocate, not a lawyer, but close enough to matter, and legal enough to be permitted. Then, the night before she filed her own motion to appear, her phone rang. It was Marcus Webb. His voice was low. "I shouldn't be calling," he said, "but there's a box in my car. 3 case files I lost against Crestline. Every document I gathered. You might be able to." He paused. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more." "You're doing it now," Maya said. Eleanor Carter had been teaching 8th grade mathematics in Morrow for 31 years before she retired, and the precision she had once applied to lesson plans, she now applied to Sunday dinners, which meant that the collard greens were never overcooked. The cornbread was always pulled from the oven at exactly the right moment, and the sweet tea in the mason jars on the table was strong enough to make younger people's eyes go wide. She was 70 years old, and she moved through her kitchen with the unhurried authority of a woman who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone decades ago. That Sunday, the kitchen was full of neighbors and relatives who had come because word had traveled, as word always traveled in a neighborhood where people had been watching out for each other, long enough to know when someone needed company more than privacy. The Ellisons had already signed their papers and moved to her daughter's house in Augusta. The Pruitts were packing boxes. Another family 2 streets over had received a letter identical to Raymond's, and had not yet decided what to do. The conversation moved through the kitchen in the heavy, circular way of people, discussing something they cannot fix, full of sympathy and practical helplessness, and the particular grief of watching a pattern continue that everyone recognizes and no one can stop. Eleanor let them talk. She served the food and she listened, and she let the conversation exhaust itself. And then she said, without raising her voice, "They smile at you while they take from you. That's not new. Different name, same hands." The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when someone names the truth that everyone has been talking around. Then Eleanor picked up the serving spoon and said something else. Something she mentioned the way you mentioned the weather, a detail she had observed and filed and not thought about since. When Crestline bought the Ellison property, they sent a crew out to reset the boundary markers. I was pulling weeds along my fence line when they did it. The marker that had been sitting next to my post for 20 years. The next morning, it was 4 feet east. Just like that. 4 feet. Maya set down her fork. The sound it made against the plate was the only sound in the room. "You're certain?" she said. "Baby," Eleanor said, in the voice she had used for 3 decades when a student tried to question arithmetic she had worked out before they were born. "I taught geometry for 31 years. I know where 4 feet is." Maya did not speak again for the rest of the meal. But under the table, in the brown notebook, she drew a circle around a word and pressed her pen into the paper hard enough to leave an impression on the page beneath. Moved. After the dishes were done and the neighbors had gone home, Eleanor led Maya to the storage room off the back hallway. She reached past folded quilts and boxes of old textbooks and brought down a bag, black leather, old enough that the stitching had darkened with age, but the body of it still firm and solid. "This belonged to your great-grandmother," Eleanor said. "Ida Mae Carter. She was the first black woman to work inside the Morrow County Courthouse. She was a clerk from 1955 to 1971, which means she was in that building the entire time they were pretending black people were welcome to use the front door." She set the bag on the table between them. She kept a notebook the whole time she worked there. Every ruling she witnessed, every name, every case involving a black family. She wrote it all down because she said someone would need it someday. She looked at Maya steadily. "I think today might be that day." Maya did not sleep for 3 nights in a row, and by the 3rd night, she had stopped thinking of sleeplessness as deprivation and started thinking of it as a condition she was using. The floor of her bedroom had disappeared under a geography of paper. Raymond's deed, the Crestline survey, Marcus Webb's 3 case files, the Ellison transfer documents, printouts from the county's public records portal, and 2 hand-drawn overlays she had constructed on graph paper with a ruler and colored pencils, working from the coordinate data in each survey with the methodical patience of someone who had once wanted to be a lawyer and had never stopped thinking like one. The 2 overlays, when placed one on top of the other against the lamplight, told a story that no one had thought to look for because the answer required combining documents that were kept in entirely separate offices and that nobody had reason to compare unless they were already asking the right question. The starting reference point in Douglas Mercer's survey for the Carter property was 12 feet east of the original county monument. The same shift appeared in his survey for the Ellison property the year before. And in the 3 cases, Marcus Webb had lost the same surveyor, the same direction, the same precise 12-foot displacement. Maya sat back on her heels and looked at the ceiling and breathed, not from exhaustion, from the specific, vertiginous feeling of understanding something that was worse than you had feared. She had found the mechanism, the method by which a strip of land could be legally claimed from a family that had owned it for 2 decades, using a survey that was technically professional, conducted by a licensed expert, based on data that had been quietly, precisely, deliberately corrupted at the source. She picked up her laptop and spent the next 40 minutes tracing the GPS software that Mercer's firm used for boundary assessments. The software had received an update in 2019. The update had not come from the manufacturer. It had originated from an IP address, registered to a property management firm in Atlanta that shared a mailing address with one of Crestline's subsidiary companies. The software itself had been instructed to apply a fixed offset to coordinates within a specific geographic zone that covered the entire south side of Morrow. Every survey Mercer ran in that zone since 2019 had been producing coordinates that were systematically wrong. Mercer may not have known, or he may have known and chosen to believe the paperwork he was handed. Both of those were true things about people, and Maya had enough experience with the way systems worked to understand that corruption did not require everyone inside it to be actively malicious. It only required enough people to look the other way at the right moments. At 2:15 in the morning, she opened the county's public financial disclosure portal. Every elected and appointed official in Morrow County was required to file an annual disclosure of their financial interests. The filings were public record, available to any citizen who thought to request them. She found Warren Hargrove's most recent disclosure on page 11 of a 30-page PDF that she suspected no one had opened in the 12 months since it was submitted. The entry was a single line: investment interest, Crestline Property Group LLC, estimated value $200,000. She read it 3 times. Then she found the second thing, a reference to Meridian Capital Advisors, a limited liability company, in which Hargrove held a membership interest and which had received consulting fees from Crestline following several property acquisitions in Morrow County over the past 4 years. Not a passive investor, a partner, a participant. Every family on the south side that had lost a case in his courtroom had made Warren Hargrove richer in a direct, documentable, financial sense. Maya pulled an index card from the stack on her desk. She wrote one question on it in the careful, deliberate print she had developed in childhood and never lost. She drew 2 lines under it. She placed it in the front pocket of Ida May's leather bag and did not look at it again until the morning of the hearing. The Morrow Public Library opened at 9 in the morning, and Maya was waiting at the door by 8:55. Ida May's bag over her shoulder and the brown notebook under her arm every morning for the 8 days before the hearing. The librarian, Patricia Walsh, was a white woman in her early 60s who had been running the reference section for longer than Maya had been alive, and who had the particular quality of certain librarians, a complete absence of judgment about why anyone might need to know anything. By the 3rd morning, Patricia had stopped asking what Maya was looking for and had started anticipating it, setting aside materials before Maya arrived, pulling case law on judicial conflicts of interest from Georgia's appellate records, printing precedents from other states where financial relationships between judges and litigants had resulted in disqualification and reversal. On the 4th morning, she placed a bound stack of printouts on Maya's usual table before Maya had taken her coat off. Georgia Judicial Conduct, Canon 3, past 15 years, Patricia said. I printed it last night. Maya looked up. Why are you doing this? Patricia looked at her with the calm directness of someone who had decided long ago to spend their life making information available to people who needed it. Because this library belongs to everyone in this town, she said. And because I've lived here long enough to know exactly what's been happening on the south side, and I've been waiting a long time for someone to walk in here and actually start looking. The county records office was a different kind of encounter. Simone Hayes had worked behind that counter for 8 years, a black woman in her mid-30s who had learned to perform a particular brand of neutral efficiency that was required of anyone who needed to keep their job inside a system they did not entirely trust. When Maya slid the request form across the counter, Simone looked at the name Carter, and something moved behind her eyes. Not enough for a stranger to read, but enough for Maya, who had learned to notice the things people tried not to show. Simone pulled the files without comment, but inside the folder she handed back was a single sheet of paper that Maya had not requested. A list of 8 property disputes involving black families on the south side of Morrow, all heard in Hargrove's courtroom over the past 5 years, all ruled in Crestline's favor. No name signed the bottom of that page, just data, clean and cold and devastating. In the archive section of the library, Maya found one more thing: a box of old court records, misfiled decades ago and never properly cataloged, containing the transcript of a 1987 property hearing involving a man named James Carter, her grandfather, who had contested a boundary claim in the Morrow County Courthouse and lost in 35 minutes before a judge named Arthur Hargrove Sr. The evidence her grandfather had presented was documented in the transcript. It was coherent. It was relevant. It had been dismissed without meaningful engagement. Maya sat with that document for a long time in the quiet of the archive room, not moving, not writing anything down, just reading the same pages over and over until she understood in her bones what she had already known in her mind. This was not a new problem. It was an old one wearing a more sophisticated mask. That evening, in Eleanor's kitchen, they practiced. Eleanor played the opposing attorney with a ferocity that surprised Maya the first time and stopped surprising her after the second, because Eleanor had spent 30 years teaching children to think under pressure and understood exactly what it took to prepare someone to function clearly when everything around them was designed to make them fail. They went until midnight. They went again the next night. By the last session, Maya could recite her argument, counter every objection she could anticipate, and present her evidence in sequence without glancing at a single note. Eleanor made hot tea, and they sat at the table in silence for a while, and then Eleanor said, "Your great-grandmother sat in that building for 16 years and watched people get taken apart in that courtroom, and she wrote every word of it down because she believed it would matter eventually." She paused. Make it matter. The drive to the courthouse took 11 minutes, and neither Maya nor Raymond said much during it. The mist was still hanging low over Oleander Street when they pulled out, and Maya could see the Carter's sign in the side mirror as they drove away from it, faded and still standing, the same as it had always been. Raymond wore the suit he had worn to Diane's funeral 5 years ago, and Maya noticed without comment that he had pressed it himself, that the crease in the trousers was clean, that he had polished his shoes until they reflected the light coming through the car window. People put on their best things when they were going somewhere that was supposed to treat them with dignity, and they needed to remind themselves they deserved it. At the courthouse entrance, they were barely through the door before Warren Hargrove appeared in the lobby, not yet robed, moving between offices with the ease of a man in a building that has belonged to his family for 3 generations. He saw Maya and stopped. The expression that crossed his face lasted only a moment, a particular kind of contempt that did not bother to fully form before it was covered by the professional blankness that powerful men learn to wear in public. And then he said, addressing no one specifically but loudly enough for the lobby to hear, that he wasn't aware the county had started letting people use the courthouse as a walk-in center, and that perhaps someone should look into that. There was laughter, not from everyone, but from enough people that Maya felt the specific way a room full of adults can make a person understand they are considered less than serious. And she stood very still in the center of it and let it pass through her without taking anything with her when it left. Patricia Dunmore, Crestline's attorney, arrived 20 minutes later and glanced at Maya with the efficient, dismissive assessment of someone cataloging an obstacle they do not expect to require much effort. Maya placed Ida May's bag on the respondent's table, opened it with both hands, arranged her folders in the order she had determined 3 days ago, and sat down. Her spine was straight. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her feet were flat on the floor. She was the stillest person in the room. Hargrove allowed her motion to appear, reluctantly, with a warning delivered from the bench in the measured tone of a man who was not accustomed to being surprised and was managing that condition in real time. "I'll be watching everything," he said. "One misstep." "Understood, Your Honor," Maya said. Dunmore's opening statement was smooth and practiced, the kind of performance that comes from knowing you have never lost in this room and do not expect to start today. She presented Crestline as responsible development, spoke about property values and community investment, and described the boundary survey as the work of a licensed professional with a 25-year record. During the lunch recess, a man in a dark blazer who had been sitting in the gallery approached Raymond in the hallway and spoke quietly about a cash settlement. $95,000, available immediately, all disputes resolved. Raymond looked at his hands. He looked at the floor. The number was large enough to hurt, large enough to pull at the part of him that was tired and frightened and had been carrying this weight alone since Diane died. Maya was standing 2 feet away, and her phone had been recording since before the man appeared. Because she had known this moment was coming the way you know certain things when you have been paying attention long enough. She waited until he finished speaking. Then she said, with a steadiness that surprised the man, and, in a quieter way, surprised her father, "We'll see you back inside." The afternoon session filled the courtroom past its comfortable capacity, people standing along the back wall and pressed against the glass panels of the door. Because word had moved through the south side of Morrow during the lunch hour, the way important things always moved there. Person to person, quietly and fast. Among them was Gerald Okafor, a retired civil rights attorney 30 years out of Atlanta, who had followed Kevin Osie's coverage of the Carter case since the week before, and driven down that morning to see the afternoon session himself. Kevin Osie had come that morning on a tip from a friend and had been live tweeting since noon. He had 8,000 shares by the time Maya called her first witness of the afternoon, and 40,000 people watching when she began her cross-examination of Douglas Mercer. She started gently, the way Eleanor had taught her, asking about professional process and standard procedure and the documentation that a survey of this type would normally generate, letting Mercer settle into the comfortable rhythm of explaining his expertise to someone he had already decided did not understand it. Then she placed 2 transparent overlays on the railing of the witness stand. The county's original plat documentation and Mercer's boundary survey held them against the light so the courtroom could see the 2 sets of lines, and asked him to explain why his starting coordinate was 12 feet east of the monument that had anchored every survey conducted in this area for the past 20 years. Mercer said the coordinates he had used reflected the most current data available from the county's technical office. Maya placed a stamped letter from the Morrow County Survey Office on the table between them. No coordinate update had been issued for this area in 20 years. She then described the software modification, the IP address, the 2019 date stamp, the geographic zone that covered the entire south side of Morrow, the connection to a Crestline subsidiary. Mercer's face changed. It was a specific change, the kind that happens not when a person is caught in a lie, but when a person realizes they have been used as the instrument of one. His hands tightened on the armrests of the witness chair. He said quietly that he had been provided the software update by the client's office and had believed it was a legitimate version. He said he had not asked questions he should have asked. He said he was sorry, and when he said it, he was looking at Raymond Carter, who was sitting at the respondent's table, with his hands flat on the surface and his jaw set and his eyes very steady. Then Mercer reached into his jacket pocket and placed his phone on the railing. On the screen was a chain of emails from a Crestline account, time-stamped, specifying the exact coordinates he was to use for the Carter survey, and citing the GPS update as the justification. He had kept them. For 4 years he had kept them because people who are asked to do things they should not do sometimes keep the evidence as a form of insurance against the day the invoice comes due. The courtroom erupted. Dunmore was on her feet. Hargrove brought the gavel down 3 times. Maya waited. She waited until the room had gone from noise back to the specific kind of silence. That means everyone in a space has arrived at the same threshold, at the same moment, and then she turned away from the witness stand, and she looked up at the bench, and she spoke. "Your Honor, before you rule, I have one final question. Not for the witness, for the record." Hargrove said she was out of order. She did not stop. She stated, clearly and without inflection, that according to the public financial disclosure filed by Warren Hargrove with the Morrow County Clerk's office, he held an investment interest in Crestline Property Group valued at $200,000. She stated that she had further identified his membership in Meridian Capital Advisors, a limited liability company that had received consulting fees from Crestline following multiple property acquisitions in this county. She reached into Ida Mae's bag and brought out the index card, the one she had written at 3 in the morning, the one with 2 lines under it, and she read the question she had written there in a voice that did not waver and hands that did not shake. In 5 years, 8 black families in this county have lost property disputes against Crestline in this courtroom. Each time they lost, you made money. Not indirectly, directly. Can you explain to the people sitting in this room today? People who came here believing this court existed to give them a fair hearing. How that is possible? Warren Hargrove stood. His hand was raised toward the bailiff. The bailiff moved and then stopped by Gerald Okafor, who rose from the third row and stated, calmly and precisely, that Maya was presenting evidence from public records in an active proceeding, and that any effort to remove her from the courtroom in this moment would constitute a procedural violation subject to immediate federal appeal. The bailiff looked at the judge. The judge looked at the room. He looked at 40 pairs of eyes that held something he had not seen in 18 years of rulings. Not deference, not the practiced stillness of people who had already accepted the outcome, but the steady, clear, unintimidated attention of people who were watching him, and who were being watched in turn by a number he could not see, but could no longer pretend did not exist. He set the gavel down without using it. He gathered his papers from the bench with both hands. He said, in a voice so low that the people in the back had to lean forward to hear it, that the court was in indefinite recess. He walked through the side door and did not look back. The ruling came 8 days later, delivered by Judge Diane Holloway of Savannah, the first black woman ever assigned to a Morrow County proceeding, who had reviewed the full record over 4 days with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that getting this wrong would mean something larger than any individual case. Her findings were unambiguous. The boundary claim against Carter's Auto and Body Shop was dismissed in its entirety. The survey submitted by Crestline Property Group was declared unreliable, produced through a methodology that had been compromised at its source. All 8 property disputes involving Crestline and black property owners in Morrow County over the preceding 5 years were reopened for review. Every pending acquisition Crestline had been pursuing in the county was suspended pending the outcome of a referral to the Georgia Attorney General's office. Warren Hargrove was formally suspended the same day and subsequently stripped of his license to practice law by the Georgia Judicial Standards Commission following an investigation that documented financial conflicts spanning 14 years and 12 cases, every one of them involving black families on the south side of Morrow. The name Hargrove was removed from the bronze plaque at the courthouse entrance. 3 generations of that name had been associated with that building. The association ended there. The investigation that followed moved beyond Morrow with a speed that suggested the infrastructure for it had been waiting for someone to provide the trigger. Federal investigators identified 11 additional judges across 4 southern states who held undisclosed financial relationships with real estate development companies operating in predominantly black communities. The Morrow case became the organizing precedent for a congressional hearing on judicial financial transparency that Maya was invited to testify before, sitting at a table in a hearing room in Washington and speaking with the same precision and steadiness she had brought to a courtroom in Georgia where a man had told her she had no place being. Crestline Property Group's parent fund, the national investment vehicle whose existence had been the first truth Maya had uncovered, was placed under federal investigation for coordinated land acquisition practices across 6 states. Patricia Dunmore cooperated fully with prosecutors in exchange for immunity, providing the complete operational structure of Crestline's network in Morrow and the names of additional officials who had received payments she had not known about until the moment Mercer's emails appeared on the witness stand. She later established a nonprofit providing free legal representation to black property owners in 3 Georgia counties. Douglas Mercer lost his surveying license, but was not prosecuted, having provided the email chain that formed the backbone of the criminal case against Crestline's leadership. Simone Hayes, the records clerk who had placed an unsigned list in a folder and handed it to a young woman she had never met, was protected under Georgia's whistleblower statute. Her sister's house, lost in a Crestline acquisition 2 years prior, ruled against in Hargrove's courtroom in 40 minutes, was returned to her following the review ordered by Judge Holloway. When Raymond Carter heard that, he sat down in his chair behind the counter at the garage and put his head in his hands and breathed for a long time without speaking. Kevin Osie's coverage of the Morrow hearing was picked up by 3 regional outlets and eventually by 2 national ones, and it changed the shape of his career in ways he had not expected. But what he remembered most clearly for years afterward was not the numbers or the reach, but the moment just before Maya read from the index card, the particular quality of the stillness in that room, the way 40 people had stopped breathing at exactly the same instant. On the Sunday after Judge Holloway's ruling, Raymond Carter bought a can of white paint and a brush and went to the shop early, before the street traffic picked up, and worked for 2 hours on the sign while Maya held the ladder and the October morning opened up around them, clear and cool, and carrying the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the block. When he stepped back and looked at what he had done, the letters were clean and even. The way everything Raymond Carter made with his hands was clean and even. And underneath the original name and date, he had added 4 words that had become true, in the way that certain things become true, not by being declared, but by being survived. Maya read them from the ground, one hand still on the ladder, her head tilted back in the morning light, and felt something in her chest unlock that she had not known was closed. Carter's Auto and Body Shop, Est, 2004, still standing. 2 months later, the University of Georgia School of Law called. A coalition of black attorneys who had watched the Morrow hearing and understood what they were watching had endowed a full scholarship in Maya's name, renewable through graduation, with a letter that said simply that the law needed people who already knew what it was for. Maya accepted. She enrolled in January. On the first day of classes, she carried Ida Mae's bag, and inside it, wrapped in the same cloth Ida Mae had used to protect it through 16 years inside a courthouse that had not always treated her like a full human being, was the notebook. The record of everything one woman had seen and written down in the faith that one day the writing would matter. Maya had added to it herself now, new pages in new ink, a different generation's accounting of the same essential truth, that the people with the power to harm you are counting on your silence, and that the most dangerous thing you can do to them is simply, methodically, courageously refuse to provide it. If this story hit you somewhere real, hit like and subscribe so we can keep telling the ones that matter. Drop a comment below. What moment stayed with you? And where in the world are you watching from?